Ty. We're ready to get into our lesson here, and lesson number 1 is titled, The Gospel Comes to Thessalonica. And as we mentioned, our first 3 lessons are really just going to be setting the table historically, theologically. Who was Paul? Where was this taking place? When was this taking place? Et cetera, et cetera. And so here in our first lesson, the gospel comes to Thessalonica. We just want to hone in here on 2 words.
Thessalonica
and
the gospel.
The gospel. So I'll start and talk a little bit about Thessalonica, where this all fits into the book of Acts, and sort of get a feel for
the historic setting.
Yeah, just sort of the historic setting. So let's sort of set the table. Let's even go back to Saul's conversion.
Okay.
We know that Stephen was stoned in fulfillment of the 70-week prophecy of Daniel 9 in AD 34. That was the closing of probation for the Jewish nation as a nation. And Saul's, this is Acts 7 and 8. Saul's conversion takes place shortly after that. That's Acts 9. And then
sometime in 34 or 35.
Sometime AD 34 or 35. So that's Saul's conversion in Acts 9. Acts 10, of course, is the vision where Peter says, hey, the gospel, he gets the vision of the sheet coming down. Hey, the gospel's going to the Gentiles, and God had his man. And his man was?
Paul now.
Paul.
Saul converted, Paul now.
Exactly. So now, kind of a strange thing happens here. We don't know a lot about the details. We just glean some little details from the book of Galatians. Paul tells us that after he was converted, rather than going right into the mission field, so to speak, though he certainly would have been doing some preaching, he heads off to where?
Arabia,
and not just for a 14-day vacation.
14 years.
He tells us in Galatians 2, verse 1, that he went to Arabia for 14 years.
That's a long time.
A really long time.
He's in Arabia 14 years. What is he doing there?
Well, we don't know all of the details. There's this great big parenthesis in the book of Acts, and we don't really know a lot of what Paul was doing. We glean this 14-year period, not from Acts itself, but from Paul's own words about what happened after his conversion in Galatians 1 and 2.
Right.
What he's doing there is he's being taught the gospel. He's almost having
directly, by the way.
Directly from Jesus.
Because he gives that testimony that he did not receive the gospel from men, but from Jesus himself. So he's in school with Jesus for 14 years.
Which is awesome.
It is awesome.
So he's having basically a Moses experience here. He's learning. He's shepherding. We don't know exactly what he was doing. It's impossible to conceive that he wasn't doing some preaching.
The gospel can't be contained.
No, he was doing some preaching. But again, it's a great big parenthesis. We don't know a lot of details. But at some point, according to Galatians, he comes out and he goes and he meets Peter. And he basically sits down with Peter and says, Peter, this is the gospel as I understand it. Peter says, yes, that's the gospel as I understand it. And then Paul goes from there on sort of his first little missionary journey, which gets him into some trouble with certain Judaizers, and the council at Jerusalem is convened, and this takes place in Acts chapter 15.
Yes.
So as near as we can tell, the council at Jerusalem would have taken place in about AD 50. Now, if you're doing your math there, remember Saul's converted around, or Saul to Paul, around AD 34, 35, so there's your 14 years. The Jerusalem council's around AD 50. And basically, the Jerusalem council listens to the arguments from both the Judaizers and from Paul, who clearly has already been preaching now. And he is saying, no, circumcision is not required. His gospel is being preached also to the Gentiles. This is making some people a little nervous because this was a very Jewish thing. The whole Old Testament is Jewish, and the Messiah was Jewish. And here Paul, especially after the vision of Peter, the gospel is starting to inch. Well, in fact, of the groups that were available in the first century there, the group that the gospel and the church is growing fastest among is the Gentile community. And some of the old guard, if we can use that language, was nervous about it. They didn't like it.
Right.
So they convene this council at Jerusalem. Paul presents his case. The Judaizers present their case. This is all communicated in Acts 15, and the Jerusalem council comes down on the side of who?
Paul.
Very much on the side of Paul. They say, hey, it seemed good to us and to the Holy Spirit, they say.
We want to confirm you. God is definitely leading you.
Total confirmation of their ministry, and they write a letter. And they basically give this letter to Paul and his traveling companions and say, you can show this letter to anybody that you go and teach and preach to, that you have the sort of the imprimatur of us here in Jerusalem. An interesting little thought on that, Ty, is that it looks like it's James who's sort of heading out in the council at Jerusalem.
Yeah, definitely.
Not, as we often think,
Peter.
Peter.
Yeah.
So then Paul leaves the council at Jerusalem, goes on his second missionary journey.
A more extensive journey.
More extensive, and this is where, in fact, I think I've got my Bible open to it here. In the book of Acts, just as Acts 15 is going away, as Acts 15 is ending, rather, right at the beginning of Acts chapter 16, Paul receives this Macedonian call. And I'm just going to read that here. Acts chapter 16, beginning in verse 6. It says, "Now when they had gone through Phrygia and the region of Galatia, they were forbidden by the Holy Spirit to preach the word in Asia. After they had come to Mysia, they tried to go into Bithynia, but the Spirit did not permit them. So passing by Mysia, they came down to Troas, and a vision appeared to Paul in the night. A man of Macedonia stood and pleaded with him, saying, 'Come over to Macedonia and help us.' Now after he had seen the vision, immediately we sought to go to Macedonia, concluding that the Lord had called us to preach the gospel to them." So Luke is with him here, and they travel to, in fact, if you have a map there, you can see they sailed from Troas over to Philippi. And in Acts 16, we read that things didn't go so well for them in Philippi. They're basically kicked out of the city. They were imprisoned.
And beaten before they were kicked out.
We know the story of the Philippian jailer who's about ready to kill himself with the sword, but Paul says, don't do that. He receives the gospel. His whole family receives the gospel, but they were ushered out of Philippi, right? So Paul's first evangelistic stop did not go perfectly well. So he ends up here in Thessalonica. Now, I'm just going to read, this brings us right up to speed, Acts chapter 17, beginning in verse 1. "Now when they had passed through Amphipolis and Apollonia, they came to Thessalonica, where there was a synagogue of the Jews." And here we are. This brings us right up to speed. This is taking place sometime between the Council of Jerusalem in AD about 50 and when Paul wrote his letter to the Thessalonians, the first one, which is around AD 52. So this is sometime AD 50, 51, 52. And according to the verse here, verse 2, it says that he spends 3 weeks in Thessalonica. It says, "Then Paul, as his custom was, went into them." Now this is where we're about ready to hand the baton off to you here. "And for 3 Sabbaths he reasoned with them from the Scriptures, explaining and demonstrating that the Christ had to suffer and rise again from the dead, saying that this Jesus whom I preach to you is the Christ. And some of them were persuaded, and a great multitude of devout Greeks, and not a few of the leading women joined Paul and Silas."
Incredible.
So after 3 weeks, they are kicked out of the city. They're run out, just like they were run out of Philippi by basically a mob of ruffians. And they then go for a short time to Berea, and then they eventually end up in Athens. And so that sort of sets the stage here where we're at historically. We're going to be talking more about Thessalonica in detail in a coming lesson. But that sort of gives us a feel for where this is taking place in the stream of time in the early church. And our lesson is titled, "The Gospel Comes to Thessalonica." So this is right at the beginning of Paul's second missionary journey, around AD 50, 51, maybe as late as early 52. And he goes into the synagogue. This is apparently his strategy, and our lesson brings this out. And he preaches this thing called the gospel. Okay, so here I am. I show up in town. I'm Paul. What am I saying?
Well, there are 2 things for sure that are vital insights that are given to us in Acts 17, 1 through 3, as features of this missionary endeavor that Paul is engaged in. Number 1, David, it's very clear here that he's preaching the gospel from the Scriptures.
Okay.
The Scriptures he has in his possession, of course, are the Old Testament Scriptures.
Okay.
The New Testament doesn't exist. In fact, it's in the process of being written by Paul himself, Peter, John, etc. He's preaching from the Scriptures. And it's interesting, David, because in verse 3, he is explaining to them the gospel from the Scriptures.
Okay.
He is explaining to them that Christ had to suffer.
Okay.
So while we're not given the exact passages that Paul is preaching from to those in Thessalonica, we know that he is bringing to them the suffering aspect of the Messiah. He's pointing them to Old Testament Scriptures that foretell that the Messiah, when he comes, this first Advent Messiah time, he's going to suffer. He's going to experience some kind of suffering. This is not what people prior to the advent of Christ were expecting. They were expecting, as the lesson brings out, a triumphant, conquering, warrior type Messiah.
Okay.
And all of that's there too in the Old Testament.
Okay.
But Jesus came the first time, and it says in verse 3 here, he had to suffer, and Paul is pointing to those scriptures. Specifically, most likely, he is preaching Isaiah 53 and other passages that indicate the cross of Christ.
Now, this would have been breaking news then. This would not have gone along with the basic messianic expectation of the Jews.
Absolutely not.
Okay.
And this is why it's so scandalous, the New Testament tells us. Paul says the gospel is an absolute scandal.
The Greeks think it's foolishness. The Jews say it's
That's right. That's right. Because for the Greek mind, the only way to conceive of God at all is in terms of power over, dominance,
complete
control.
Perfection.
That's right. And for the Jews, they essentially are expecting the same kind of God that the Greeks conceive of, a God of power and dominance, a warrior figure. And here comes the creator of the universe from heaven to earth, the one who does in fact possess all power. And he demonstrates a kind of power under rather than a power over. Rather than engaging the sin problem and engaging the rebellion of the human race with dominance and control and that kind of coercive power, he comes and he suffers. He submits himself, and he demonstrates a totally different quality and kind of power at the cross. It's very fascinating, David. When Paul defines the gospel, 1 Corinthians chapter 15, for example, he says, I came to you preaching the gospel, and then he explains what that gospel includes. First, he says that Christ died for us, for our sins, according to the scriptures. He resurrected, he ascended. For Paul, this is the gospel.
The holy history of Jesus Christ.
That's right. The Christ event in totality constitutes the gospel. And it is a gospel that includes this suffering element, this submission element to death, self-giving love for the human race. It's the most powerful thing imaginable, because rather than exerting power over, it gets into the human heart and arouses a voluntary response, keeps our free will intact, and therefore gives rise to a more powerful power than force or coercion, and that is the power of voluntary love arising from the inside out. And that's the beauty. That's the genius of the gospel. That's the genius of grace.
Now, just a few questions on that. When we use the word gospel, then, if I'm hearing what you're saying, Ty, we're not talking about a what as much as a who.
That's right.
Okay, so
Which is vital to realize.
Okay.
The gospel is personified in Jesus. He is the good news, the glad tidings, the happy message acted out in living form.
Now, when you say good news, glad tidings, happy message, those are all basically English versions of possible translations of the word gospel.
Yes, anyone will do whatever fits better into your mind. All of them are perfectly accurate.
The word gospel means good news.
Good news, glad tidings, happy message.
Okay. So the gospel is not a concept, it's not a theory, it's not an idea or a philosophy. The gospel is the good news of the holy history of the man Jesus Christ, who was God in flesh.
Amen.
So one of my favorite quotations from Ellen White, one of your favorite quotations from Ellen White, says this expressly. We've quoted it before in the commentaries. We're going to quote it here again. 6 Bible Commentary, page 1113, where Ellen White says, hanging upon the cross, Christ was the gospel. It's not just that he preached it. It's not just that he advertised it. He was the gospel. Okay, so now here's a question. Paul comes to Thessalonica. It's AD 50, 51. He's been a believer now for the better part of sort of 16-ish years, 15-ish years, and he walks into the synagogue of the Jews, and he starts preaching this suffering Messiah. How do the Jews, let's go back to Acts chapter 17, and let's just read, how do the people respond to this, what would have been a radical, I mean, a culturally, psychologically, spiritually, theologically radical concept?
Mm-hmm. They become a mob.
Well, let's see what it says here. It says, explaining and demonstrating, I love that, explaining and demonstrating that the Christ had to suffer and rise again from the dead, and saying, this Jesus whom I preach to you is the Christ, or is the Messiah. Mm-hmm. Now, something the lesson brings out there, and I'll just quickly note it, is that this language here, had to suffer, is the very same language that Jesus used in Luke 24 when he was speaking to the two disciples that were walking on the road to Emmaus, and he said the Messiah had to suffer. Mm-hmm. So this idea, Paul is just using that exact same language. Verse 4, it says, and some of them were persuaded. Would to God it said, and all of them were persuaded.
Yes.
But the fact that only some were persuaded is testament to the fact that this was fundamentally different. It was just relative to what they were expecting to hear. Okay. By the way, maybe we should just say here quickly, what is a synagogue?
Well, it was a place of worship that was familiar to the Jews at that time.
So it was a meeting place is basically what it was. Okay. So some of them were persuaded, and a great multitude of the devout Greeks and not a few of the leading women joined Paul and Silas. So it sort of seems here that those that Paul had the greatest success among in Thessalonica was not primarily his Jewish audience,
right?
But it was
Greeks and women.
And this is very consistent with what the New Testament reveals. You basically had three groups of people. You had the Palestinian Jews, you had the Hellenistic Jews, and you had the Gentiles. Mm-hmm. And as we read the New Testament and as we look at church history, the gospel went fastest and farthest and most quickly among the Gentiles, then among the Hellenistic Jews, and it had its toughest time among the Palestinian Jews, who were so rooted in their various and sundry and incorrect ideas of who and what the Messiah would be.
Yes.
Okay, so we have set the table here. Paul shows up in Thessalonica. He's heard the Macedonian call. He walks into the synagogue. He's there for 3 weeks, and he's preaching the holy history of the man Jesus Christ, not a power from above, but a power from within and from under. Not an over, but an under power. And this is going to set the table for our next lesson, which is titled Preserving Relationships. As we're going to learn, Paul is rushed out of town, and all he can think about is those people that had responded positively to his message, and he's just wondering how they're doing. So that basically brings us up to speed on our first lesson. I think we've set a very good start here, a very good tone.
Yes. We've got the historical setting, and we've got the theme, the central theme, the gospel of Christ.
Excellent.